Today, we're going to talk about Egyptian-Israeli relations, and more specifically, the 1979 peace treaty between the two countries. Wait, peace treaties? That doesn't sound very interesting, does it? Well, let's start off with an assassination, shall we? That always spices things up a bit. On October 6, 1981, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was gunned down at a military parade by his own soldiers. What was the reason for Sadat's assassination? Well, in 1979, he signed a peace treaty with his formidable foe, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, on the White House lawn under the proud gaze of then US President Jimmy Carter. Sadat and Begin were an unlikely pair to sign a peace agreement. Sadat once gushed about Hitler, saying, "My dear Hitler, I admire you from the bottom of my heart." And Begin, on the other hand, his family was murdered by the Nazis, and he had been called terrorist number one by the British for his attacks on pre-state Palestine. Talk about an odd couple. It's hard to overstate the enmity between the two countries. Egypt had led the other Arab countries in war against Israel 5 times within just 30 years. Death to the Jews and drive the Jews into the sea were practically Egypt's mantras at this point. Egypt refused to negotiate with Israel or make peace with Israel. So, with a relationship like this, how did the two sides come to peace? Well, the road to peace is full of surprises, and to get there, let's first get to know Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin a little better. In many ways, they were similar. Both oozed charisma, were white-collared kind of guys in a Middle Eastern milieu, and both had genuine attachments to their respective religious faiths. They both began their careers as underground nationalists fighting colonial British occupation in their lands. In the 40s, Begin headed the Irgun, a militant underground organization that declared a revolt against British rule in Palestine and that many, including Ben-Gurion, considered to be a terrorist group. The Irgun's most famous attack was the bombing of the British headquarters at the King David Hotel, which killed 91 people. The Irgun sent a warning for people to evacuate the building prior to the attack in order to prevent civilian casualties. During the revolt against the British, Begin had a $50,000 bounty on his head, wanted dead or alive. Now, during roughly the same period, Anwar Sadat was conspiring with Nazi spies to overthrow the British in Cairo, but his plans were betrayed by a belly dancer. I'd love to see a movie about that one. Soon after, Sadat and then-President-to-be Gamal Abdel Nasser founded the Underground Free Officers Movement, and Sadat urged the group to take on terrorism as a tactic. He planned to blow up the British embassy and everyone in it, but the plan was eventually nixed. So, how did the two countries eventually reach peace? Well, ironically, through war. In 1973, on Yom Kippur, Sadat launched a surprise invasion of the Israeli-controlled Sinai, and Israel was caught totally off guard. At the time, Israel had an inflated sense of power and invincibility as a result of its total victory in the Six-Day War of 1967, and they couldn't imagine that Egypt would dare start a new war after its crushing defeat. Now, Egypt seemed to disagree. Although Israel won the ensuing Yom Kippur War, or the Ramadan War as referred to by the Egyptians, the success of Egypt's initial attack astonished the world, and Israel suffered devastating losses. Israel's sense of invincibility was shattered, and Egyptian pride was restored. Former president of Al-Quds University, Sari Insaibe, remarked, "The Arabs had shown that the Israelis were mortals after all. We won by not losing." Surprisingly, it later became clear that this had been Sadat's primary objective all along. He actually hadn't planned to win the war at all, or conquer the Sinai. His goal was to make a bold move that would surprise the world, change the political status quo, restore Egyptian pride, and jumpstart new peace negotiations with Israel, with Egypt now in a stronger position of power. Now, it took a few years for Sadat's moves to pay off, but in 1977, Menachem Begin, who for years was marginalized as a hawkish radical nationalist, shocked the country by being elected the first right-wing prime minister of Israel. People were sure that he would lead Israel into another war, but Begin, who also understood the power of a bold move, surprised many with an immediate offer of peace and friendship to the surrounding Arab countries. He wasn't sure what the response would be, but a few months later, Anwar Sadat went off script while speaking to the Egyptian parliament and, violating all Arab norms, announced that he was willing to visit Israel to discuss peace. His audience was stunned, especially his comrade Yasser Arafat, then chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO for short. The next day, Begin officially invited Sadat to visit Jerusalem. Sadat's plane landed in Israel 8 days later. Tensions were high on the runway, and the head of the IDF was concerned that this visit might actually be an elaborate ruse for a new war or even a terror attack. After all, the 70s had become the decade of international terrorism, only to be then surpassed by the 80s, and then the 90s, and then the 2000s, but you get the idea. many Israelis watched with euphoric hope. And in a surreal moment, Sadat descended the stairs and met all of his former arch-enemies. On the red carpet, he shook hands and schmoozed with them. And then he and Begin embraced. The following day, Sadat spoke about peace to the Israeli parliament. Now, this is the part where Sadat and Begin shake hands and sign a peace agreement, right? Well, not so fast, because first comes the haggling. Sadat had been warned that Begin was a tough negotiator, but that his word was his bond. But Sadat wasn't quite aware how tough he would be. Begin, the lawyer, was extremely detail-oriented, examining all the fine print, while Sadat was more impulsive and wanted to sweep away the technicalities. Sadat saw Begin as dragging his feet, while Begin thought Sadat and Carter didn't understand that handing over the Sinai to Egypt and the West Bank to the PLO would be a threat to Israel's very existence. After all, Egypt had attacked from the Sinai in war after war, and the PLO, which had carried out the worst terror attack in Israel's history just a few months earlier, still held the ultimate goal of destroying Israel. After almost a year of negotiations, they finally came to an agreement. Begin, who had previously said that he would lose an eye before removing a single Jewish settlement, agreed to do just that, and he handed over the Sinai to Egypt. This shocked many of his most ardent supporters, but in exchange, Sadat agreed not to push Begin on giving the West Bank to the PLO. As a result, Sadat achieved peace with Israel, but at the expense of the Palestinians, showing that the national goals of Egypt were more important to him than the larger goals of pan-Arab nationalism. This was the moment the Arab-Israeli conflict became what is now known as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and Sadat would soon pay for this decision. So, what enabled Begin and Sadat to go against so many of their supporters and reach a compromise? Well, it had a lot to do with their personalities. They both spent most of their careers on the political fringe, and when the two unlikely leaders came to power, they both wanted to leave a lasting impact. They were men of action. When they saw opportunities, they seized the moment. They were willing to take bold leaps that surprised and even alienated their own supporters. At the same time, they both kept their eyes on the prize, never losing sight of their political aims. They said what they meant and they meant what they said. And if this meant transforming from hardcore militant enemies to political peacemakers, then that's what they would do. True to his word, Begin passionately defended his new position and the need for peace to the Israeli public. He paid the painful price of evicting Israelis from their homes, witnessing the confrontation between the Israeli army and its own citizens, and losing much of the support of his own political base. In his skillful way with words, he argued, "We are fighting for peace today. We are blessed to have reached this point. Yes, there are difficulties in peace. There is pain in peace. There are victims for peace. They are all preferable to the victims of war." In December 1978, Begin and Sadat were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and later, in March 1979, the former enemies signed the official peace agreement at the White House before a worldwide audience. Begin praised Sadat for his courage and even called him his friend, although in actuality, they were still more like frenemies. A little while later, Israelis and Egyptians met at El Arish for the ceremonial transfer of control of the Sinai back to Egypt. 4 buses rolled up to the event, 2 from Egypt and 2 from Israel. The doors opened, and wounded veterans who had fought each other in 5 wars emerged. Now, there's a famous story about one blind Israeli veteran who asked his little boy to lead him to the Egyptian soldiers. The boy replied that he was scared, but the father reassured his son that these Egyptians were good. This blind veteran had the ability to see beyond the abstraction and recognize the humanity of his enemy. Soon, the group of sworn enemies were embracing, showing us that human beings who have been trained to hate each other really can relinquish that hatred for peace. The peace agreement made Sadat the most reviled leader in the Arab world, and Egypt was eventually expelled from the Arab League, which it had founded. After Sadat's assassination in 1981 by an Egyptian political opponent who disagreed with Sadat's peaceful overtures, Begin, in a show of solidarity, flew to Cairo to attend the funeral. Now, this saga leaves us with a lot of questions that don't necessarily have answers. Why is it that it's often the militants who eventually become the peacemakers? Is there some sort of pragmatism in men like Sadat and Begin that allows them to determine what techniques to use and when to use them? Is it because they have street cred that allows them to make bold moves that others simply couldn't get away with? Or is it the drama and gesture of renouncing your extremism, which, let's be honest, you can't do if you never were an extremist, that bridges the gap with your opponent, opening the path for peace? I think one clear lesson here is that painful sacrifice is sometimes necessary for change. Big decisions come with an expensive price. Facts on the ground change, and people can change. And when viewing the other as a person rather than a political abstraction, we learn that we really can unring the bell and move forward. And at that moment, we see peace becomes possible.